These are your visual notes for speciation, your last major set of notes for this unit. How do new species arise? So let me grab my marker, which means first we have to talk about what a species is. So a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And fertile just means the ability to also reproduce. So I'll say can also reproduce. It is possible to have sterile offspring that cannot reproduce, like a donkey and a mule, a donkey and a horse can breed with each other, so they can interbreed, but their offspring are infertile. And the mule, the resulting offspring, is sterile. It cannot reproduce, so therefore the donkey and the horse you can deduce are different species. So yes, you have to be able to interbreed, but the offspring also must be fertile. Another example of this is like a lion and a tiger can interbreed to make a liger, but the liger is sterile, it's infertile. So therefore, the tiger and the lion were different species. So that's the definition of a species. Speciation is the process by which different genetically distinct or different species arise. It's the formation of new species. And this is one of the key questions that Darwin was trying to answer when he proposed natural selection, right? Why are there so many species? What mechanism generated the millions of species that we've currently now documented, and probably millions more that we don't know about? So that's what we're looking at here, right? Ultimately, and this is the overarching picture, ultimately, as organisms gain adaptations, as their genetics change and mutate and get selected for over millennia and millennia, millions and millions of years, these differences accumulate to a point where interbreeding is impossible, right? And at that point, and it's not always clear when that point is, you would call these two different. So as an example, let me just give you an example of how it's kind of hard sometimes to say when something is a new species. Let's say you have species A, and there's a canyon or some kind of physical impediment here. And over time, I'm kind of up here in the top left, over time, so time is this way, going up is going forward in time. Part of this population kind of lives on this side of this canyon or river, or ocean, whatever it is, and part of it lives on this side, so I'll call this B, or I'll call this A1 and A2. And while they're over here, they don't interact with each other at all, but some point, kind of maybe, let's just say in modern times, they come back together. Well, let's say when they come back together, they can't interbreed anymore. They can't make fertile offspring. So let's call these species B and species C. At what point did species A break into two different species, species B and species C? Well, it's not always an obvious answer. Similarly, it's not always obvious that there's a first individual of any species, which is why a lot of I'll go back to it really briefly, myth-telling stories don't make a lot of sense. There was never a first human. Evolutionarily, it doesn't make sense for there to be a first anything, because the definition of a species is so hard to define sometimes. And sometimes, like, maybe if we took an individual from population A1 and mated it with an individual from population A2, maybe a mating attempt would have been successful 50% of the time, but unsuccessful the other half of the time. So, like, are they species? Are they different species? Are they the same species? Well, sometimes their reproductive attempts work and sometimes they don't work. So it's hard to define when they're a species. And I'll give you another example and then we'll move on. In World War II, as London was getting bombed by the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and humans went down into, I'm going to mess up the name. They're not called subway stations in London. The Tube or something. Oh, I'm embarrassing myself. Anyway, so when people went down into the subway stations, down into the tunnels, so did mosquitoes because they were a primary food source for mosquitoes. And in just the 2-3 years that London was getting bombed pretty regularly in World War II, the group of mosquitoes that stayed above ground and the group of mosquitoes that went below ground, while initially were the same species, when Londoners came back up to the surface and kind of stopped living underground, and the mosquitoes followed them, a lot of the mosquitoes that went underground could no longer interbreed with the mosquitoes that stayed above ground. And again, we talked about this last video where a lot of insect species with very, very quick generation times, it's easy to see this really quick evolution. And that's what we actually saw. We saw the creation of a new mosquito species during World War II in a matter of years. And again, when they became new species is kind of hard to define because like half of the time, some mosquitoes could still mate with mosquitoes above ground and half the time they couldn't. So I'm gonna keep going, but I'm giving you kind of extra information here, but know what a species is and kind of the ultimate process here that gets speciation, the accumulation of changes to the point where organisms eventually can no longer interbreed. So before we continue, I want to just highlight again really quick that the unit of evolution is a population, right? It's a group of organisms of the same species. Remember, you don't evolve. Individuals don't evolve. Individuals live or die, right? I'll say individuals live or die. It's the population that evolves, right? As certain individuals live and reproduce more than others, or die later in life after they've had offspring, that's the mechanism behind evolution. It's the population that changes over time, not specific individuals. This is not Pokemon where Squirtle evolves into Wartortle, right? Individuals live and die. It's the population that evolves. And remember that, again, populations are genetically diverse. The default is for things like RNA polymerase and DNA polymerase to make mistakes. That's the origin of a lot of the mutations that get passed on. So there's a little video up here that you can click on or just type in about salamander evolution and salamander speciation in California, but I'm going to keep going. There are two types, so I wanted to say this, there are two types that we're going to talk about. There's reproductive isolation. Well, let's just start with reproductive isolation here. I'm going to back up. In order to get new species, the organisms, the individuals, have to get separated. They have to get separated in some way, which means they can no longer reproduce with each other for an extended amount of time. This is called reproductive isolation. There are three main ways to get reproductive isolation. It can be a physical barrier preventing mixing between the two groups. It can be some kind of behavior or something involving time, temporal. So let's look. So geographical isolation is where a physical barrier splits a population. It can be a river, it can be a canyon, it can be the vacuum of space if humans ever want to colonize another planet. It can be an ocean, right? It can be any physical thing or distance, right? If it keeps those two populations, population 1 and population 2, separate from long enough, and the two don't interbreed, they don't change genes with each other, and the genetic changes accumulate in each population over time, it is possible that some point in the future, if you try to breed an organism from 1 and 2 together, it won't work. And at that point, you will have said, oh, well, they're different species now, right? So this is geographic isolation. Here's some examples. 2 types of squirrels in the Grand Canyon have speciated in this manner, the kaibab and the abert on either side. I'm going to just keep going. You guys can either pause and look at this or not on your own. Another example is this kind of group of birds that include the ostrich and the emu and the cassowary, which are vicious birds, the kiwi, which are separated by oceans as a result of plate tectonics. Wrasses are a group of fish, and they were separated by the Isthmus of Panama, this strip of land between the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. So those are 3 examples there. I didn't want to go too quickly. Again, you can pause as you see fit. Temporal isolation is basically when you are ready to reproduce. So birds, a lot of amphibians have mating seasons, right? Even a lot of mammals have mating seasons too. And let's say if your mating seasons are different, then you're never going to reproduce. Is this an issue with humans? Do humans experience temporal isolation? Think about it. The answer is that we don't. We don't, right? It doesn't matter if it's winter, spring, summer, fall. It could be midnight or noon. It does not matter. Humans can reproduce with each other whenever we want. So this doesn't really apply to humans, but it does apply to a lot of other species. It's very common in birds that have distinct mating seasons, even mating locations. This is part of the reason why they migrate, because certain areas it's where their nests are and where the food resources are, right? Also very common in frogs, toads, other amphibians, etc. Give me 1 second. All right, I'm back. I had to pause really quick. All right, behavioral. Sorry, I got distracted. Behavioral isolation. This is when there's some kind of mating ritual. It could be a song, it could be a dance, it could be a scent that is not understood by other individuals of that group. So they could have different courtship behaviors, croaking or intonation or pitch or things like that for birds or frogs or smells, right? And you might say, this is a really complicated thing. I mean, it doesn't take a lot to break a song or to break a scent or to make it a little bit off. A single substitution or a deletion in a specific gene that codes for vocal cord length, perhaps, or it can make the muscle tissue just a little bit more dense, and the vocal cords can change the sound of it, and maybe that changes the likelihood that a mating pair happens. It's not that hard to get these changes, is what I'm trying to say, and can be accounted for by evolution. All right, speed of evolution. How fast can organisms change? And there are 2 models for this. One is gradualism, proposed by Darwin, and one proposed by someone called Stephen Jay Gould. He's no longer with us, but he was on The Simpsons, actually, called punctuated equilibrium. So let's go ahead and look at gradualism first. This was Darwin's proposal, and this is still applicable for a lot of species. This is gradual and continuous change. So in the fossil record, you would see very slight modifications over time. In a graphical form, you would kind of have these sloping lines that were not rigid or angular or anything like that, showing that as you move forward in time, going up the y-axis, you're gaining morphology, different shapes. Morph just means shape, like Animorphs from the 90s or whenever that was a popular series. All right. Whereas punctuated equilibrium is saying, hey, there's equilibrium, there's really nothing happening, but it's punctuated by really quick, abrupt change. So in the fossil record, you might see everything look the same for a long amount of time, and then all of a sudden, you kind of have this abrupt change. And you see different fossils. And then that stays. So you have similarities, you have stasis, there's really no change at all. You have a period of rapid change followed by another period of no change. So this is, again, your equilibriums, your stases, are punctuated by rapid change. So graphically, you would have rapid change. I'm down here in the graph, right here. Rapid change, stasis. Rapid change, stasis. Rapid change, stasis. From our perspective, rapid change might still be super, super slow. Like when we're saying rapid change, we're still talking about, millions potentially of years, 1, 2, 3 million years. You're like, well, that's not quick at all. That's horribly slow. Well, remember that evolutionary time has billions of years to work with. Our 70, 80, 90-year lifespan is laughable compared to that, right? So remember, quick or rapid evolutionarily is still on the order of millions of years. And these periods, these prolonged periods of stasis, 10 to 100 million years easily. This also gets you things like living fossils. Really good example of this is, what are they called? Oh, what are those crabs called? Oh, horseshoe crabs. There you go. Horseshoe crabs have kind of essentially looked the same for millions of years. They're a living fossil is what we call it. It's basically periods of minimal environmental change for them in their environment, and they just look the same as a result. Not going to focus on it too much here. Foraminiferans are kind of marine protozoans with shells, which makes them fossilize very nicely because shells are hard. And they're marine, so they bury in sediment very quickly. When they die, they sink to the bottom and they get covered up. So perfect for fossilizing. And a lot of our evidence for punctuated equilibrium actually comes from foraminiferans, right? So that's why they're on this slide. But again, very, very kind of minimal change here in the graph. You have stasis, quick change, and then stasis, so on, from about 5 million to now, years ago. All right, here's Stephen Jay Gould. I told you he was in The Simpsons, so there he is. Another visual to visualize. So punctuated equilibrium, right? You have no change, quick change, no change, right? Very angular lines. Whereas gradualism, what Darwin proposed, was very gradual accumulation of changes over time that eventually culminate in different species that can't interbreed. Right? This is what I'm talking about. They might all be descended from this orange bird down bottom, and by the time they're up here, the yellow and the red bird might be able to reproduce never, 0% of the time. You would say, oh, they're different species then. But maybe here, they could have reproduced successfully 70% of the time, and maybe here, they could have reproduced 30% of the time. So again, when along this pathway, when in evolutionary time, did this orange species speciate into this yellow and the red one? And that is kind of an open discussion. And again, this is why it makes no sense to say there's the first humans or the first birds or anything like that. Because the transition from one species to two or to multiple is not instant. It's not instantaneous. It's oftentimes very muddled and very unclear, right? So stuff to think about. Here's some more graphs of all the same stuff. And I actually am not going to cover this because we have talked about this before. This is just convergent and divergent evolution. But I will leave you on, not very detailed, but still it contains the major groups of organisms, tree of life. So kind of visually just kind of getting a sense as to what's related to what in general. So you can go ahead and look at this on your own. We will kind of talk about this as the rest of the year goes on when we do classification. Here's another one. Where are we? Just to kind of orient you. These are all single-celled. These are your bacteria over here on your left. Your eukaryota are your eukaryotes. So you have single-celled protists and all of your animals, fungi, plants. So very, very general tree of life, and all the animals are right there. It's not too terribly detailed, but I'll show you some more detailed versions of these as we continue. So those were your notes. I hope this helped, and I will see you in class.